Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you who are joining us from across the world today. We are delighted and honored to have with us Dr. Aysha Akhtar and Dr. Carol Treasure. Dr. Akhtar is double board certified in neurology and preventive medicine and also has a master's degree in public health. She is the deputy director of the Army's Traumatic Brain Injury Program. She has previously worked for the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats for the Food and Drug Administration. She's also lieutenant commander in the US Public Health Service, in which she often deploys to assist with national public health emergencies. She's also a fellow of the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics and is a consultant editor to the Journal of Animal Ethics. She is the author of 2 books, Animals and Public Health and Our Symphony with Animals. Dr. Carol Treasure is the founder and CEO of XCellR8, the world leader in animal-free in vitro safety and efficacy testing for global cosmetics brands, chemical companies, and ingredient manufacturers. Dr. Treasure did her PhD at Fund for the Replacement of Animals in Medical Experiments at the University of Nottingham. Her academic career was focused on the development of reconstructed human skin models for non-animal testing. She started XCellR8 after working in the pharmaceutical and biosciences industries. Welcome to Pandemic Country, Dr. Akhtar and Treasure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for having us.
Well, I want to make sure that I get that intro in because both of you here are so accomplished, and I didn't want to short by just doing a very simple intro there. So pardon for the lengthy introduction. We are thrilled to have both of you on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. No worries. I actually just wanted to make one correction if I can. So I was a former deputy director of the Army and commander, but I'm now working as the president and CEO of the Center for Contemporary Sciences, which it kind of overlaps with what Dr. Treasure is doing. We're trying to replace the use of animals with superior human-based testing methods in medical research.
Wonderful. Okay, so that sort of prompts me to sort of ask the question. Dr. Aysha, I would love to hear sort of the antecedents of your inspiring story, and also, if you could provide some context to the problem space that you are particularly making a difference in. This, the one that you just mentioned, that would be helpful. I mean, just so that our audience gets a little context to the problems that we are trying to address in our conversation today by both of you.
Sure. It's of course, I'm happy to. It's a bit of a long story, so I'll try my best to keep it short. So I always knew I was going to be working on, I would be working in the medical sciences at some point in my career. But when I was in high school, I started to learn about animal protection and how we treat other animals. And that was very much an eye-opener for me. I and my family then went vegetarian and then eventually vegan when we made that connection. And I started to learn about the use of animals in medical research and experimentation. And that really hit me hard because I grew up worshiping medical researchers and I grew up worshiping the sciences. And it hit me hard to think that these kinds of things can be done to animals. Some very, very cruel experiments can be done for animals, often for no real benefit for humans. And as I moved in my career in medical sciences and I got my MD and then became a neurologist and so on, I started to learn more and more about the limitations of animal testing for human benefit. And so what I learned is really, and it's not to say that animal testing never works, but largely animal testing is really a very ineffective way in studying human biology and human diseases. I mean, we know that a dog's biology is very unique, a rat's biology is very unique, a mouse's biology is very unique, and so is a human's biology. And no human really is fully mimics another human being. That's why in clinical trials, we try to enroll people from very diverse backgrounds because we know there's so many differences even within our own species. So it became very clear to me that not only is animal research an ethical concern for the animals, but it's also an ethical concern for humans. And so I started to ask the question, is animal experimentation really the most ethical way to study human diseases for our benefit? Is it reliably leading to effective treatments for us and reliably predictive of human outcomes? And many scientists, and Dr. Treasure is I'm sure one of them now, many more and more scientists now are starting to ask this question. And we are starting to see more and more people taking a hard look at the data. And when we do take a hard look, a very systematic look at the data, what we are finding is that no, animal experimentation is very unreliable in predicting what we're going to see in humans. So we need better ways. We need better ways, not only because it's cruel to animals, but it's also cruel to us because a lot of resources are spent in animal experimentation. A lot of lives are in the balance as we are waiting for treatments and cures. A lot of people are harmed in clinical trials when they enroll in clinical trials because of misleading effects, safety effects in animals. So we need something better even for our own sakes. So that ultimately brought me to the Center for Contemporary Sciences. We launched in May of 2020, right at the very beginning of the pandemic. not a great time to start in some ways. But we're very new, but our goal is to be a build bridger, in a sense, to bring scientists, academics, governmental agencies, funders, investors, companies, all who are interested in seeing real progress in medical research and want to see these superior testing methods that are coming out that are based on human biology become the new paradigm in medical research. So our goal is to help accelerate the development and the use of these really great, exciting new testing methods that are coming out.
Okay. So, Dr. Carol, the word accelerate was used just by Dr. Aysha Akhtar here. So is what you do similarly aligned? I mean, how did you come to sort of the same or similar conclusions to Dr. Akhtar here in your particular area? And what inspired or motivated you to do this?
Well, I can certainly identify with a lot of the things that Aysha just shared just now. I would say that really I've just been obsessed with nature and animals ever since I was a young child, going out bird watching with my dad. I grew up in London, but my dad would always make sure that we went out to the countryside and that I knew all the names of all the birds and animals and flowers. And I guess that led me into naturally sort of gravitating to biology. But as I kind of moved through that career structure, and maybe not having enough imagination or access to the kind of information that we all have these days, I just kind of went through that sort of fairly normal route, I suppose, and ended up working in the pharmaceutical industry. And it was there that I witnessed animal testing taking place very early on in my career, seeing the experiments that would take place to assure the safety and efficacy of drugs destined for humans. And even then, I guess as a naive young scientist, I felt that there has to be a better way, not just ethically, but importantly, scientifically too. I completely agree with the previous comments that animals are so completely different. Their physiology is so completely different. And I'm sure we'll come on to discuss cosmetics a little bit, but especially if you think about the differences in skin between the animals. We don't have fur, we don't have all those hair follicles, the structure is completely different. So I guess I was just quite excited by the prospect of being able to make an impact and to combine my love of animals with a scientific career. And when I got the opportunity to do a PhD at the Frame Lab, which is the Fund for the Replacement of Animals in Medical Experiments, I kind of jumped at that chance, and that was 25 years ago. And I've never looked back, really. I've stayed in that field all my life, and just became a trustee of Frame. So it's been really nice to kind of go full circle with that charity and to offer something back. But I would say that it's been a long haul, because if we look back to those times 25 years ago, we didn't have the kind of technology that we have at our fingertips today. And several groups, including the Frame Lab, were starting to culture human skin cells and other types of human cells in the dish to be able to keep those alive, to test chemicals, cosmetic ingredients, and so on. And that was perhaps quite rightly ridiculed because it was such a simple system. And lots of people were criticizing, saying, how can you try to predict human effects by looking at a layer of cells in a dish? And I think the important thing really for us to appreciate now is that, yes, we knew we were starting out with something that was really basic and that was going to come under criticism. But if we hadn't have really put ourselves out there and done that work at that time, all of the technologies that have built on that ever since over the last few decades wouldn't be here. So things like reconstructed tissue engineered skin, which we're now using at XCellR8 on an everyday basis, tissue engineered cornea tissue from the eye, from the lining of the mouth. We have all kinds of technologies which we can come on to discuss, but the complexity of those has arisen because those groups kind of really jumped in and tried to do something differently all those years ago. And I think it's just a good lesson, really, that sometimes today there are areas where we think surely that's not possible, but you just have to start somewhere. You have to take the first step.
Karthika, I think you're wanting to jump in for sure.
Thanks, Lavi. So Dr. Aysha and Dr. Carol, in addition to animal cruelty, are there like other inherent problems associated with the prevalent testing methods that we have? And Dr. Carol in particular, how does your company help solve that problem? And I'll come back to a question for Aysha on that as well.
Yeah, I'd say that in terms of the science, as we've outlined already, there are clear differences between the animal physiology. So that's a drawback in addition to the ethics. Also, I think that when we're looking at a whole animal, we don't have the possibility to really zoom in on a particular tissue, a particular type of cells, and to understand the detailed mechanism of what's happening in response to a cosmetic ingredient or a chemical. So I think that one of the great things about the new in vitro technologies is that we can really zoom in and understand an awful lot more about what's going on in human cells and how that's going to relate to real life situations. And I think there's a real drive now to think about risk-based exposure and risk-based assessments, which isn't just looking at ticking a box of you know, is this a skin corrosive? Is it a skin allergen, for example, or is it going to cause cancer? It's thinking about the whole big picture. How is this ingredient or product going to be used in everyday life? And therefore, what does this tick box mean? Is it relevant? Is it not relevant? Is this product going to be rinsed off? Is it going to be left on the skin? Is it going to be used in a cleaning product? Is it going to be used every day in a confined space or with ventilation? All these kind of things play in. So I think from a scientific perspective, when you're just doing, or, you know, obviously we don't do this, but when animal tests are done, they're not really looking at those particular scenarios, whereas you have the freedom with some of these new methods using human cells and tissues to really create an environment that's going to help you to simulate real life. And I would say also there are a number of environmental concerns around using animal testing, not only because of the amount of waste and the implication that has for the environment, but one of the key ingredients that is sometimes used in testing is derived from animals. It's called Fetal Bovine Serum. And this, as the name suggests, is derived from a calf fetus, and it's a byproduct of the slaughterhouses in the meat industry. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about all of these testing technologies, whether they're animal methods or they are in vitro alternative methods, what impact are we having is it really animal-free testing when it's still using an animal-derived component in the test? Fetal bovine serum is still used in more than 90% of cell cultures for research and testing purposes around the world. And so in that sense, there is still a very clear link with the meat industry. We know that the meat industry is one of the main contributors to the environmental issues and the climate change that we have going on today, partly because the amount of deforestation that's happening due to the amount of land that's needed, not only for animals to graze, but for to grow enough feedstock for them. And so when we are using products which are actually dependent upon that meat industry, you know, it's all linked up together. And I think that one of the things that's really struck me over the last couple of years on my own journey with this is that you can't just look at animal testing as an isolated issue and say animal testing is wrong, we need to stop. Well, yes, we do, and we've known that for a long time. But to me, it's really closely linked, inextricably linked to the human relationship with animals and the wider issues about veganism. What type of relationship do we want to have with the species with whom we share the planet? And how compassionate do we want to be? And so I think that there are real issues coming up to face not only animal testing, but also those who are doing traditional replacements. If they're still using animal-derived components such as fecal bovine serum, there are still ethical, scientific, and environmental issues associated with that. And you know, what we do at XCellR8, we're the only completely animal-free testing lab in the world that is working to a regulatory standard. So we help companies to perform these safety and efficacy tests without using any animal-derived components at all in the test. So in that sense, we're a vegan lab. Now, we didn't set out to describe ourselves as vegan. We always wanted to just eradicate those animal components for all the reasons I just described. But essentially, we are a vegan lab. And I think that people who are working in this area of replacing animal testing really need to consider this big question: what is truly animal-free testing? Are we going for a halfway house where actually there's a bit of a smokescreen there? A lot of companies are still using a lot of animal-derived components to culture those cells. Or are we really being transparent about the issues that are still there and making every effort to move towards a really ethical, truly ethical testing system? There's a lot of things I think that members of the public who maybe not as involved with the details of the science behind the testing don't necessarily realise that this is happening. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do is to make that digestible for the public and help people who are non-scientists to understand some of these issues.
Well, exactly why we're sort of having this panel. Kathy, I think you had a question for Dr. Aysha.
Yeah, I do have a question for Dr. Aysha, which is predominantly around what other testing protocols exist, and like, are they more reliable and efficient than animal testing? And I think to Dr. Carroll's point about the whole fetal bovine serum, the only reason I kind of even know about it is because there was a recent protest, I believe, with regards to the COVID vaccine and the use of FBS.
Yeah, so as far as going back to also a little bit to your original question about, is animal testing really scientifically the best way to understand human diseases? And the answer is absolutely not. This is, you think about, we're using, in a sense, and I hate to say the word tool to describe sentient beings, but we're using a tool that we used 200, 300 years ago. And you think in every other scientific field, we've moved on from using what we originally used, right? We don't even use the same space shuttle design and rocket designs we used in the 50s to get up to the moon. And in that case, at least those were successful. We don't even have that to be able to really say about much of animal experimentation. So there's a huge bias, though, intrinsic bias, to continue to use animal experimentation, despite the immense failure rate. So I worked at the Food and Drug Administration for 10 years, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So we're the regulatory agency that oversees drug development and approves the drug based on safety and efficacy data. And, even though the Food and Drug Administration has noticed and acknowledged, come out publicly stated this, as well as the Secretary of Health and Human Services and other medical agencies have talked about that there is about a 90 to 95% failure rate in drug development. And and you think about that, right? There's no other industry in the world that accepts that kind of failure rate. I mean, can you imagine if you were to hop on a plane and the pilot said, okay, we have about 5 to 10% chance of landing safely at our destination, a 5 to 10% chance of success. I think everyone would immediately hop off the plane, and we would demand a complete rehaul of the industry. But for some reason, we continue to accept that failure rate when it comes to the very drugs that we put into our bodies. And that is just absolutely dismal. And what we are seeing is that a large part of that failure rate is due to the reliance, the continued use of animals in experimentation, that they are failing to predict the safety problems that we see in humans, failing to really predict whether or not a drug or a vaccine or some other medical treatment is going to be effective in humans. So we know there is a scientific imperative to replace the use of animals. But despite that, even within the Food and Drug Administration, the scientists still say, oh, we still need animal testing. We're still going to ask for animal testing. We're still going to demand it for every drug that is, every new drug package that comes, that is delivered to us and that we have to review. And it's because of tradition, it's because of comfort, and it's because of a number of reasons. I mean, you would think that scientists would be open-minded. That's what science is about, right? Open-minded to incorporating new information and taking new information and making changes. But that hasn't happened here. But there is a slow trend, and we are starting to see that people are saying, okay, we definitely need something better. We need better techniques. We need techniques that are based on human biology. And this comes back to what Carol was mentioning. And there are a lot of new techniques that are being developed now that are just absolutely amazing and absolutely innovative. One is, which has been garnering a lot of attention, is organs on a chip technology. And so what this technology is you take a human organ, let's say like a lung, and you distill it down to its microcomponents onto a microchip. And the human organ, the lung on a chip, breathes and functions like a full human lung. And so you can really study, as Carol mentioned before, really get focused in your study and really evaluate closely what's happening at the cellular level, what's happening when the lung is exposed to a potential new chemical or a potential drug, or what is happening in lung-related diseases. We can really study them much more closely. So this is one type of technology. There are many others. There are three-dimensional, there are organoids. These are mini organs actually grown in the lab. They're larger components than an organ on a chip. The organ on a chip technology, what the next stage, I think, which will be really exciting, is to connect all the different organs. So, we have a lung on a chip. There are different versions of mini brains on a chip, kidney on a chip, liver on a chip, gut on a chip, heart on a chip, and so on. But the next stage would be really to connect all of these organs with a circulatory system, some kind of a nervous system, and lymphatic system, and so on, to really recreate the human body on a chip. And, it's just so exciting because these technologies have a lot of people are excited about these technologies and how they can replace the use of animals in testing and be superior. And that's really key here. It's not just a replacement of the use of animals. It is replacement of use of animals with superior technology, with superior methods. And that is really key. And so, you know, at Center for Contemporary Sciences, our goal is really to help accelerate the creation of more of these methods and get them into the hands of the researchers who would use them.
So I have a sort of a, I guess, a timely question, maybe, right? Well, the world's sort of looking to be vaccinated, you know, several millions of people, billions potentially. So in the issues of efficacy, effectiveness, and the accuracy of some of these testing that has been done, I'm assuming a large amount of that has been done on animals, and of course there have been human trials, as I know. So what, you know, should we be concerned? I'm not advocating not taking the vaccine, but in a such of a large scale deployment where billions of us are probably going to get this vaccine, should there be any concerns about the testing protocols, or should we not worry about it? They've killed enough animals, so we should be happy with that. There's some assurance, or should we be concerned? I don't want to wade into something controversial, but I'm just wondering. I'm just listening to what you're saying, and I'm saying, with the world just about to get vaccinated in mass, and you know what you've just said about the efficacy and the actual effectiveness of current testing methods, sort of brings to a point, you know, should we be worried then about what's going to happen shortly here?
In general, vaccines, we pretty much know what, you know, what we're trying to create with vaccines. And, you know, vaccines are, of all things to create, honestly, as far as drugs and therapeutics are concerned, vaccines are probably among the easiest, just because we know what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is to stimulate our own immune systems to see the virus as an enemy as much as possible. And so vaccines are using maybe parts of a virus, or what's called deactivated viruses, which are killed whole virus particles, to prime our immune systems to be ready in case we are exposed to a live virus, right? To be primed and ready to fight that virus. And so this is in a sense, the idea of vaccine development is something that's been around for a long time. Now, the development of vaccines for COVID-19 has occurred at a rate that is definitely unprecedented. The shortest time period to create a vaccine was 4 years, and that was, I think, for measles or mumps. I forgot which one it was, and that was the shortest time period ever before the COVID-19 vaccine. With this vaccine, what happened is, because of the need to accelerate the development, a lot of animal tests were done not before human tests, but were done side by side with the human tests. So they were done in concert with the human tests, which really begs the question, why bother doing them at all, really? So what I would say is this: one, we should never feel comfortable. We should never feel that because something has been tested on animals, that means that it's going to be safe and effective on humans. That's because the data suggests otherwise, right? That 95% failure rate, 90 to 95% failure rate, really tells us otherwise. On the other hand, clinical trials is really where we're going to find out whether a product is safe and effective in humans, ultimately. And these clinical trials, I do believe, although I don't have the personal experience, but I do believe there's probably been a great deal of oversight with these clinical trials, and that in general, vaccines tend to be largely safe for the majority of the population. So I would expect that to be the case with these vaccines as well.
Okay, that's gratifying to hear. I think there's some questions also from the audience. You want to take a few, or you have a couple more?
Yeah, no, I actually have a sort of an add-on question for Dr. Carol. And I think that'll answer one of the questions that the audience asked as well. Is that, Dr. Carol, do technologies such as AI, computer simulation, have a role in eliminating like animal testing? And what advantages, if any, do these systems kind of offer?
Did you say AI?
AI, yeah.
Yeah. So, yes, absolutely. When we're talking about the replacement of animal testing, we often seem to think automatically about the cell cultures and the kind of systems that Aysha was just describing in terms of organ on a chip and those kind of things. But really the power comes in combining those with computer modeling. And a lot of work is going into that kind of research. But I think that we have to keep in mind always that computer models are only ever as good as the data that populate them. And those models actually require the in vitro tests that we're using to keep putting in as much reference data as we possibly can. The way that those AI systems tend to work is to have maybe, you know, hundreds and hundreds of chemical structures in there for which we already have test data. And so when we look at a similar chemical structure, then that system will scan through and look for something similar and say, well, this has been tested in the past. This is the safety profile of this molecule. And you may or may not be confident to read across without doing any extra testing, or you might decide to fill in some gaps by doing some extra testing, hopefully without using any animals. And that depends on the regulatory framework that you're in. But I think purely from a scientific perspective, those AI models go hand in hand with the kind of cell culture and in vitro models that we're using. But the more in vitro methods are done, I think it's really important that companies and industry and regulators can kind of coordinate their efforts so that we can get as much data as possible into these AI databases, because collectively we have access to so much information. If we were able to collaborate together, then we would end up with more powerful AI systems, which would be better for animals and better for humans as well.
Great.
All right. Just to tag on to the question that Lavindra asked from Ritu, thanks for joining us today. She's wondering whether there is a vegan vaccine, i.e. without the FVS, especially for COVID. If not, is anyone in the process of creating one?
I don't know the answer to that because I haven't been involved with the, you know, with the pharmaceutical companies developing it and with the whole process. So I'm afraid I can't answer that one. But I do think it's, I would hope so. I think it's something that we need to aim for all vaccines for the future from a safety and ethical point of view. Aysha, I don't know if you know.
Yeah, so I did read that I don't know about fetal bovine serum as far as, you know, going back, way back to the cell cultures initially that might have been used for testing of the vaccine. But I did see several articles in which Pfizer states that their vaccine does not contain any animal ingredients. And we do now have an animal-free flu vaccine available now. So traditionally flu vaccines were developed using eggs, and now we have a cellular method that does not use eggs, and so that's an option as well. I do want to state, I know, you know, being a doctor, medical doctor myself, I know there's been a lot of people, I've heard about a lot of people saying they're not going to take the COVID vaccine because it may not be vegan or because it was tested on animals. And I would suggest you really rethink that if that's your stance, because first of all, you know, you have to do what you must do to protect yourself and your family and your loved ones. And second of all, if you think that, you know, boycotting the vaccine is going to have any kind of impact on the methods used on medical research, it's not. It's there are far too few people to boycott this vaccine or any of these vaccines to really have any kind of political impact in that sense. And so there are other ways. There are other ways to change the system. You need to take the drugs and the vaccines that may protect you and your family. And yes, by default, they're almost always tested on animals, but there are other ways to combat the system, like the way Dr. Carol's doing and the way that the Center for Contemporary Sciences is doing. So I would really suggest that you not take the vaccine because they may not be fully vegan or because they have been tested on animals. It's we have to do what we need to do to protect ourselves. And if you care about animals, we want you living and safe and healthy as long as possible, because we need everyone out there.
Good point. So Carol and Aysha both, these new technologies that you're talking about, right? Organs on a chip, and Carol, the technologies that you've pioneered at XCellR8. Why aren't more companies, pharmaceutical companies, other companies adopting these technologies? Is there a sort of a inbuilt bias, or is it because it's more expensive? What stops companies from adopting what clearly is, by all accounts from what you've said, a more effective, a better test? What's the barrier there?
I think it is happening, but it's just happening very slowly. So there's a lag time. And I think that there's a definite gap between the science and the regulatory acceptance. That is definitely an issue. So we can talk today about all these inspiring technologies that exist. Not all of them, and certainly the organ-on-a-chip systems haven't yet been accepted at an international level by the regulators. And from our perspective as a regulatory testing lab, only methods that have been formally approved by organisations like the OECD into their test guidelines programme can be used to formally demonstrate the safety of a chemical or an ingredient for a product. So in that sense, we have a restricted menu of tests that we're currently able to use. And we find that our client companies, who are cosmetic companies, chemical companies, right through to agriculture and medical devices, they are around the world complying with a number of different regulatory frameworks. And some of them still have to do the animal test if they're ever going to get their product to market. So, I know there'd be a range of opinions about, well, how to handle that commercially, ethically, etc. But those companies are still going to do those animal tests because they have to. And so I think there's a definite piece of work that is really a focus of so many people right now, is to try and get the regulators to accept the methods more rapidly. So as the new science comes through, we need to get it onto that menu of tests that can be used formally to demonstrate safety. In the pharmaceutical industry, it's slightly different because drug discovery early stage is done without having to necessarily have that international approval of the method. So they've got more flexibility to maybe use things like the organ-on-a-chip to screen some drugs in the early stages. But I do think that the regulatory side is a real problem. And I would say that the other point that I'd just like to make is that I think there's a lot of testing labs around the world, some of whom are really big organisations, who traditionally have made a lot of money out of animal testing. And perhaps over the last couple of decades, they've added on an alternative department into their organisation, but they're still primarily animal testing organisations. And I think that what's happening now is that some of those companies, the ones with foresight, who are looking ahead to the future, are realising that actually animal testing days are numbered at some point. There's an expiration date on the time that the human race is going to be testing on animals. And so now they may not be driven by the passion that some of us here today would be driven by, but they're driven by other factors, commercial factors, and also the need to be up with the advancement of science. So I think it's important that when we're trying to drive change, we think about what are the multiple buttons that we can push here. And in our experience, they've been very different in different geographical regions around the world as well, due to different cultural attitudes towards animal testing. So I think you can always find the motivation, because there are ethical, scientific, environmental, commercial reasons, all pointing towards the need to move on to new technology. But maybe there's that lag time, and we need to work on that.
Thanks, Dr. Carol. Dr. Aysha, as a neurologist, are you concerned at all about the use of optogenetics, on animals to do research?
In what way do you mean?
I know that it's a new and evolving field, and a lot of scientists are basically saying this is the future, and that's going to help us, understand a lot more about how, light, protein cells, etc., neurons react to light, etc. Are you concerned about how that's affecting the animals, or do the pros outweigh the cons?
So I'm not very familiar with optogenetics. I will say genetic manipulation in general has turned out to be quite a failure. There's been even a few decades ago, there was so much excitement in the scientific community about the idea of genetically modified mice being the way to really understand what's happening in humans. So, scientists will go and they'll change a gene or in genetic or gene expression or something in the pathway in mouse to try to create a more humanized version, and I say humanized with the quotes, version of mice. The problem with that is, so if you're changing a gene in a mouse, let's say you're adding a human gene, or you're trying to change a gene so it's more human-like in a sense in a mouse's body, is then that gene is expressed, and everything else that happens as a result of that alteration of the gene is happening in a mouse's body, not a human body. So that change is being then manipulated by all of the unique components that are all the components that are unique to a mouse's physiology. And so, now we're at this point where we've had genetically altered, genetically modified mice for decades, and it hasn't led to anything. People thought that genetically modified mice was going to lead to the cure for cancer, and we haven't gotten any closer. People have been using genetically modified mice to study Alzheimer's disease, which truly does not make sense, but it hasn't. We have nothing available for people with Alzheimer's. We have no effective treatment whatsoever. And so it's really been the idea of genetically modifying animals to make them more human-like has been a dismal failure, because short of turning them into humans, they're still not going to be reliably predictive of human outcomes.
So is there a silver lining in the testing protocols that were adopted in the COVID vaccine discovery, because they ran parallel experiments, right? So I would assume that these organizations have data that says, okay, the impact on humans was X, the impact on mice or primates or whoever else they use was Y, and it clearly shows that eventually that it's actually the human data was more reliable. So I would assume that at some point, somebody, when the rush is over and everything is done and dusted, they would revisit that data and then maybe draw conclusions that maybe we don't need to do as many animal studies, that if we can get enough human volunteers, or we get to a point where we can use maybe all these computer technologies that we're talking about, then get to a point where something is stable enough that you put it on limited human trials, that's adequate enough that we don't have to inject something, whether it's a genetically modified mouse or a primate, to get those results, right? I mean, I'm just wondering.
There's been a lot of studies, whether they've been side by side or done sequentially. There's a lot of data out there in which we can compare the animal outcomes, the outcomes of the animal experiments versus the human clinical trials. Unfortunately, with some exceptions, most scientists aren't willing to, or just don't seem to really want to go in that direction and really make a real side-by-side comparison. I think with companies, they just want to do what it's going to take to get their product to market. So they're going to do whatever the regulators tell them. If the regulators tell them that we want you to test on 2 different species, which is what the Food and Drug Administration now asks for almost every drug and vaccine, with very few exceptions, the companies are going to do that. They're going to do it, whether they think it makes sense or not. The companies are just, their end goal is to get a product to market so that they can be financially successful. And so as long as the regulators keep asking or requiring the use of animals, that's what's going to happen at that stage in the scientific research area. However, what I will say is there is a bit of a silver lining with COVID-19 in as far as the use of non-animal technologies. So in the immediate sense. There's been, in the US at least, I don't know if this is the case in the UK, there's been a real concerted effort by primate researchers to get more funding for primate research. And there's been articles saying we're running out of monkeys, we need more monkeys for vaccine development, and so on and so on. And I really think that they've been exploiting this issue and exploiting people's fears about the virus to really drive more funding towards animal research. And so that's been happening in the short term. However, long term, the vaccine, because there was such a need for a rapid development of these vaccines, a lot of these testing tools, these new testing tools that we were talking about, like human organs on a chip, that many companies may not have used in the past, and because they just don't have the comfort level, they've been, in a way, they've had to use these because they needed to have the best tools available to really be able to predict as greatly as possible what's going to happen in humans in clinical trials. We do know that no other animal species out there gets COVID-19 the way humans do. There's no perfect animal model out there. Monkeys get very much milder symptoms than humans do when we inject them with the vaccine, and every other species either shows some symptoms or not as severe symptoms or a different set of symptoms from what humans get. So I think in the long term, because more and more companies have had to use these new techniques in order to rapidly develop a vaccine, that has increased their comfort with these new techniques. And I think that's going to have a much more positive impact. And more scientists are going to be much more comfortable and much more open to using these new techniques, hopefully one day, in place of the use of animals in experimentation.
Great. So in the remaining time that we have for both of you, actually, let's shift the gaze a little bit. So what can us who are not medical or scientific personnel do to sort of make this change happen? So it was one of the questions that we have up from the audience as well. What will facilitate the change in regulatory requirements? What can we, the public, do? So what is the role that you envisage for people listening in today? How can we demand better, more effective? Forget the cruelty component for a second, but obviously you both made a very clear case for the fact that the efficacy, the effectiveness, and the actual benefit is much greater when you don't actually use animal-based testing, because you're using something as I think your cow said 200 years old, right? So why would we do that, right? So what can we do? What do you suggest that we do?
Carol, do you want to take that first?
I think it's so important that people engage with the companies who they're buying products from. And this is so much easier nowadays with, all the connectivity that we have with social media for so many people, because there are many companies out there who will kind of jump on the cruelty-free wagon, and they want to make statements. Some of the smaller companies, I would say, there are things that can be done where you could actually go to them and make sure that you are getting a safe product. Because, for example, I would go to craft fairs where people are making their own products, and there's a big banner across the back saying not tested on animals. Now, unfortunately, that usually means not tested at all. So, that should never be the case. And I think for small companies, it's just so important to make sure that you're asking the right questions about how these products are insured for their safety, even without using animals. And then for the larger companies, it's so important to write to them, by email, on social media, ask them these questions. So many of the big companies have a statement on their website that says, we don't do any animal testing except when required by a regulatory authority. And I think that we need to really ask them, well, what does that mean? And for some companies, that means that they are prepared to do animal testing so that they can sell their products in China. So there's a clear commercial driver for that. And there are some companies who absolutely flatly refuse to do any animal testing and have had to accept the commercial drawbacks of that. And so I think today's consumers, as we all know, are much more informed, much more curious about making those ethical decisions about what they're going to buy. And I think that it's just so important to keep on asking the questions, because it's only by companies realizing that their customers really care about this that they will actually understand that there's enough momentum that they seriously need to take that action.
Dr. Aysha, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so I would probably say two things that people can do. One is most of the public, I don't think, well, we know most of the public, isn't very familiar with a lot of things that go on in the scientific world. So, and when it comes to animal experimentation, there's definitely a lack of knowledge about these issues. So one thing is we really need the public to know more and more about these issues. So spread the word if you have a social media network, spread the word. You can come to the Center for Contemporary Sciences site. We have social media posts, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. I think I covered all of them, were the main ones. You can share our posts so that more and more people and posts from Carol's company and so on, talking about it really does inform people about what's going on in the scientific community, about what's happening with animals and what are the new techniques that really will replace the use of animals in experimentation and be much better for us as well. The other thing I would really highly suggest is now, with a lot of media sources, there's a public commentary section now online. So if you go to the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever journal or magazine or newspaper you may be reading, there's areas for public commentary. And so I think whenever there is something, an article that impinges on this issue whatsoever, we definitely need more voices to talk about the need to replace animal testing. And what that does is that will show then to these media sources that people do care about this issue, and hopefully we'll get media to start writing about these issues more. And again, that increases public awareness, and that public awareness, in a sense, will help drive a lot of change because companies care about their PR, right? They're going to care about their reputation. Drug companies are going to care about that. If they think the public cares about it, then they're going to have to care about it more and more. And then thirdly, I think I said two, but here's the third one.
More the merrier.
If you're in the US, for example, we can write to our Congress and say, we can write letters to our members and say, what are you doing to push the scientific community to put more funding towards human-based technologies? In the US, and I suspect this is the case largely throughout the world, but in the US, animal testing is much more heavily prioritized over the use of these other types of testing methods, as we were talking about. Much more funding goes towards the use of animals in experimentation than goes towards development and use of these superior testing methods. And those are our public dollars. Those are our tax dollars that are going towards animal experimentation. So we can demand that our representatives start really looking into this issue and start demanding of them that they make a case to put more money and prioritize their funding into more human-specific technologies over animal experimentation. I don't know how every country works in that sense, but that's an example of how we can make some change with our political leaders here in the U.S.
So we will put both these company links, both of yours and Dr. Carol's as well, on the site. But is there data that shows and studies that show, for example, the efficacy or the benefits of human or these other models of testing vis-a-vis animal testing, that we could go to your website and attach with to a letter to Congress or letter to the editor, or are there resources that we can pull from that shows that this is true, that we are actually using outdated and ineffective techniques?
Yes, so I will say if you go to our website, we are slowly building our library of evidence. So as I mentioned, we're new, but we do have one white paper on some of these new techniques and talking about how they offer benefits over animal testing. So feel free to use that. I have some articles, and Dr. Jared Bailey, who's the head of our scientific team, he has many published articles on the failure of animal testing in different fields, including the development of HIV vaccines and stroke drug treatments and so on. There are publications under our name. So you can definitely go and just Google our name and you'll find these publications as well. There are, so there are some resources. We will be developing more resources on our website, and I'm sure Carol can speak on that as well.
Yeah, and anytime you find more resources, post this conversation, feel free to send it to us, and we'll promote it through our channels happily. Right, we are a mission aligned in that way, so we're glad to make those resources available on our website and talk about it and post it on our social media channels. We're happy to do that. Dr. Carol, I mean, what kind of companies should kind of come to XCellR8? I mean, who are your? I mean, look, if there are people listening here who has a cosmetics company or an ingredient company or a chemical company, should they contact you to sort of get cruelty-free testing done?
Yes.
I was hoping you would say that.
Yeah, I mean, we do provide a lot of technical support to, we have a wide variety of companies that we're working with. Some of those are the big global names whose products nearly everybody will have in their bathrooms. And some of those are really small companies as well. And so those small companies don't tend to have their own in-house departments for that expertise. So we spend a lot of time supporting those smaller companies and helping them to ensure that they can also assess safety without needing to use any animal testing. I think it's just important to acknowledge that there is a Europe-wide ban on animal testing for cosmetic products and ingredients. So
there's one in India also, by the way. You're not supposed to test an animal.
Yeah, exactly, and in some other countries as well. Although 80% of countries still allow it around the world for cosmetics, but the latest statistics do say that nothing is happening in terms of cosmetic testing on animals in Europe. That's probably for another session, because we know that there are conflicting regulations that actually do need it. So I think that's for another day. But yes, we work with cosmetic and chemical companies. Anyone making any kind of products with chemical ingredients, from paints through to agriculture products, medical devices, etc. And that's really the enjoyment of what we're doing each day, is having that wide variety of conversations about different products in different parts of the world and how we can use these technologies to obtain the regulatory compliance.
Okay, so one final question, if I may.
I have a question.
Oh, okay, you go first. Next me.
Sorry.
We got an exact hour stop. That's why I wanted.
Yeah, just one final thing that I wanted to ask both Dr. Carol and Dr. Aysha was, do you foresee a future where doctors will be able to offer cruelty-free prescription options to their patients?
I see that. I see that option because I do see the end of animal testing at some point. This is one industry that I have a great deal of hope that we can end. There's so many, even if people only care about it for human protection and for our own well-being, this industry will end because we need to end it. It is not the best way to study human biology and to find the treatments for the diseases that afflict us. So in that sense, yes, I do see that option is going to be available at one point. When, I don't know, but our goal at CCS is to really accelerate. As Carol said, the transition has been slow. And so we need to speed up that transition. into these new techniques. So that's going to be one of our main priorities at Center for Contemporary Science, is to really speed that transition and get animals out of the lab and get in its place much better testing methods that are going to better protect our health.
Wonderful. Well, actually, that did answer my question.
Oh, it did.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I did want to ask you, because in your TED talk you said, and I think that TED talk was before this pandemic, and you said the Spanish flu was the mother of all pandemics, and you said the next one will be the mother-in-law of all pandemics.
Right.
Do you think this one was the mother-in-law of all pandemics, or are we in for another one?
No, unfortunately, I don't see any real change in our fundamental relationship with animals coming anytime soon. And the pandemics, most of them are zoonotic, meaning that we are getting them 3/4 are coming from other species. And it's not their fault. It is how we treat other animals, it's how we interact with them. It's factory farming that is leading to rapid mutation in the influenza virus, which could cause a major pandemic. It is the wildlife trade, which the live markets in China is just one small part. It is our destruction of natural habitats, ecosystems, and so on. All of those factors keep increasing our risk for a pandemic. And I hate to say this, but I think we are in line for a much worse one after this.
Well, you were accurate on your previous prediction, so so we better get our act together quickly. Thank you so much, both of you. It's been a fascinating, enlightening, educational. You name it. All of that applies to this conversation. Thank you so much for taking time from both of your very busy days to talk to us and our audience. We wish you all the very best in the coming year, and look forward to hearing more great things from both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.